Morning, David.
Good morning, Jonathan. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How are you? Nice to see you.
Beautiful sunny day today.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a nice change. Um, and well, thanks for your time and sharing your insights into, I guess, the world of private equity and investment into professional services, but particularly law firms. I guess starting with that more generally, I know there's been a huge investment into accountancy firms over the last few years. What's your view of the legal sector? Do you see that going the same way as accountancy firms in this kind of domino effect?
Broadly speaking, I think it probably will follow a similar pattern to the accountancy world. Private capital started investing in accountancy businesses about 10 years ago, and there was a steady trickle of deals, not a flood initially, until about 2023, a couple of years ago, 23, 24, when there was a huge spike in activity, and the size of the firms involved shot up, so that most famously Grant Thornton were
Yeah.
acquired by private equity. Actually, they were broken into two different bits. So Grant Thornton US was acquired by one set of investors, and Grant Thornton UK by another. And I think you'll probably see a similar. We're probably, I don't know, 2-3 years into that cycle in the legal market. Investor sentiment towards the legal market quite dramatically changed about 18 months ago, I would say. Until then, it was really quite a niche interest. Most investors were not really focused on the legal sector, but that all started to change roughly out 18 months ago. And now there's there's just so much interest in since we set up our business last May, we've had more than 500 meeting requests. And at least half of them were investment houses, and we've spoken to probably half of them. So well over 120 investors, all from large, small, medium size, all focused on the legal sector. So you wouldn't have had that a couple of years ago.
Okay, and just for people who will be listening to this and maybe managing partners or management teams who perhaps are less au fait with investment and private equity and private capital and how that works, do you want to give a kind of a thumbnail sketch of what that would mean? What does an investment look like, or how does it work for a law firm on average?
So it's a big question in a way.
Yeah.
But that because there's many different strategies, and there's many, the law firm market, people often forget it's a very, very big market. In the UK, there's over 9,000 law firms. In the US, nobody really knows, but it's probably close to 500,000 law firms, many of them quite small firms.
Yeah.
And, what often, and this is what happened in accountancy, it's happening in other professional services industries, private capital comes in at the lower end of the profession, the smaller end of the profession, I should say, with a kind of roll-up strategy, because that's often where particular sectors feel the most pressure. So the smaller firms, I think, increasingly feel pressure from the cost of talent, the cost of investing in AI and technology, the cost of compliance. All these, there's many pressures which are mounting, and it's kind of driving firms towards consolidation and to scaling up. And private capital sees that as an opportunity and is able to facilitate that. And they bring a business expertise to the party, which very often law firms don't have to the same degree. They bring pattern recognition from other industries. So essentially, private capital is a sort of transformational exercise as opposed to business as usual. If it's business as usual and you're just funding, something that's quite normal and it's an incremental change in your business, you'd probably do it via debt. You wouldn't need private capital. But if you want to transform your business, if you want to redefine your market share, if you want to get ahead in the technology and AI arms race, if you maybe want to rethink the way that the incentives you're offering to your top talent, then private equity might be for you. It's definitely not for everybody.
Yeah, and talking about top talent, I know a lot of law firms over the last few years have sort of restructured their equity to keep top talent and push the top of equity higher. How would private equity investment affect the top rainmakers? How do you keep them? How do you make sure they're still earning today as opposed to just promises of tomorrow?
So it may well be actually that particularly at the middle and upper echelons of the profession, that this is one of the drivers towards private capital investment. And I'm saying private capital, not private
Yeah,
equity, because it comes in many different.
yeah,
Private equity is just one form of investment. There's many other types of investors like family offices, institutional investors, and so on, and they all bring something different. But like I talk about private capitals encompassing all of those.
yeah.
Essentially, people who are willing to invest equity, typically, and there are many different ways in which they can do that. One of the drivers at the middle and upper echelons of the profession may well be as a response to the current issues with the partnership model, where when you think about it, the partnership model, which is pretty universal around the world in the legal profession, it's the same almost everywhere in the world. But it's usually a so-called naked in, naked out model. You don't put only nominal capital in when you join, and you get the same nominal capital out when you leave. Whenever you leave, whether you've served for 3 years or 30 years, it's the same. And a full distribution model. So almost all the profits are paid out every year. The problem with that, and this is what many firms at the top of the profession are now scratching their heads about as to whether there's a structural response to this, is that when you think about it, there's no real financial incentive for your top talent to stay, because there's, it's just it's a focus on the profits this year and that's it. And there's no financial penalty for them to leave. And so you've got this increasing velocity, particularly at the top end of the profession, of partners moving from one firm to another to get more income. It's actually a very rational behavior, but over time, from the point of view of the individual, but over time, what you can see is the interests of the individual and the interests of the firm are not aligned anymore. It's in the interest of the individual to make a jump for more money. That's logical, it's economically rational and so on, but it's not in the interest of the firm to have their top talent departing every 5 minutes. So private capital may offer one possible solution to that, because it completely changes the model and the mindset. Instead of focusing on distribution of today's profits, it's focused on creating a value which a multiple can be applied to, and that could be realized at some stage in the future. So it creates incentives for firms to think longer term and for partners to stick around to deliver that value.
But does that have an impact on the shorter term profit distribution?
Well, in the short term, obviously, if you're going to go down this route and you're going to sell a share in your firm, it doesn't necessarily mean a majority share. It could be minority. Many firms now are looking at that, and there's many investors who will countenance a minority investment. So it doesn't need to be the whole hog, if you like. But when you look at that, obviously there's got to be a share of the profits which is going to go to the investor, and the numbers have to work to make it clear that the investor can get the return that they want, but in the long run it's also going to be better for the partners. Otherwise, why would anyone do it? No one would do it. So the numbers have to work, and generally speaking, that's not difficult to achieve.
And on the return on investment, would they look, I don't know how it's worked in the accountancy firms, but would they look for the usual kind of, if it's a P model, for example, the usual kind of 3 to 5 year cycle, or is it different within professional services?
In private equity, you typically be looking at anywhere between 3 and 7 years as a typical. But then there are other investors in the market, family offices, institutional capital, who have longer term horizons. So that can be explored. And also, you've got to think about what's interesting. I think what has to be understood about this model is that when investors typically come in with this kind of arrangement, they don't take a penny out of the business typically until there's an exit. So they're highly incentivized to increase the value of that enterprise for that future exit, rather than kind of extracting a rent, if you like, all the time they're there. So the best investors are very kind of active alongside you, figuring out, working as a business partner, a growth partner, figuring out how you can together benefit from the increase in value in the business.
And one worry, I guess, or concern people listening to this might have is what impact will that have on the culture? If there's somebody, an investor who, there's lots of stories on the market, about PE. I know I'm using the PE example, and I appreciate there's others, but of a kind of more, let's say, hardline approach to numbers and to profit at the cost of maybe the more human side and the more collaborative side, which partnerships have traditionally held, high.
It's a common concern, and I think the short answer is you have to pick your partner, your investor carefully. And our advice to law firms, if they're going down this road, is when you're coming to selecting your partner, that's probably the most important decision you'll ever make. And you need to assess that on the grounds of cultural fit, strategic fit. Are you aligned in terms of what you want to achieve together? And finally, the price and the valuation. And it's in that
probably leads nicely on to your good self, David, and what your role is in this with Wim, and how you help law firms and be that sort of conduit, and what your role is.
So what we found, so Wim and I bring a kind of complementary set of skills. We worked very closely together for 8 years at A&O. When I was senior partner, he was managing partner, and then he succeeded me, of course, and led the A&O Shearman merger. But he also led the sale of AO Sphere, an online services business that A&O sold to Inflection a couple of years ago. And so he brings that experience. He's on the board of some family offices. I bring the experience of having run a big law firm as well, but also having worked in the investment world. So I've seen the world from an investor's eyes and how they analyze it. And what we've found is that, in a way, without being too flippant, sometimes law firms are from Mars and investors are from Venus. There's a kind of communication gap. Investors tend to think in terms of numbers.
Yeah.
Lawyers typically don't. They're not often persuaded just by numbers. There's others. So there's a communication gap. There's an understanding gap. So there are many law firms who don't really understand how private equity works, what it could do for their firm. There's a lot of mythology around that, so we can help with that. We can help them choose which investors they might go with. We can also help them think through how they engage with their partners on this, because we find that that's a common stumbling block, that people find it difficult to get going, engaging with their partners, whether or not they're thinking about investment, but just engaging them, what this means to the industry, what this could mean if a competitor, for example, went down this road, not necessarily whether we should go down this road. And we strongly recommend law firm leaders to be engaging with their partnership early. It's actually strategic in itself to be engaging with your partnership and preparing them for big decisions that may be necessary at some stage in the future. The sooner you start preparing for that, the better. You don't need to commit to any particular decision, but you do need to prepare the partnership. And the bigger the partnership, the longer that takes.
Okay, and what about other blocks, such as regulatory blocks? Having a look myself, I saw currently, and I may be wrong on this, you need to be an ABS model to take investment in the UK, and it seems that if you're a US firm, most states kind of block it and from any external investment. That's just my sort of helicopter view of it.
Broadly speaking, probably most lawyers already know the answer to this, so I won't go into too much detail, but broadly speaking, in England and Wales, at least, this is not true yet in Scotland, but in England and Wales, external investment in law firms has been allowed for, since the Legal Services Act came into force 2007. And so the same is true in Australia. The same is true in Arizona in the US, but not in almost every other state. There's one or two kind of slightly quirky exceptions, but generally speaking, in most states in America and most countries in continental Europe, there are bar rules which prevent external investment and or sharing of fees with people who are not qualified as lawyers. I think that those rules are outdated and they are going to be outflanked. And my metaphor is the Maginot Line. It looks very impressive. It looks like it was put up by the French after the First World War to stop the Germans invading them again. And what happened? They just went round it. And so I think this is a good metaphor for these rules. They were created in times when law firms were very, very different. They were a fraction of the size they are now, and they don't actually work. They don't stop external investment because there's a device called a management service organization, so-called MSOs, which I'm sure many of your listeners will have heard about, which is a well-established technique. You basically separate out the practice of law, which is regulated and you can't have investors in, from the business of law. So you separate all your business activities other than the pure legal side of it into a separate company, and it's perfectly fine for investors to invest in that. And that is the route that many firms have already gone down in the US, and that is gathering momentum in the US. It's not an issue in England, Wales, you don't need it. The problem I have with that device is it works. I think it works. It's worked in healthcare, it's worked in audit, it's worked in other sectors. It's going to happen in law because it's the only way in which you can do external investment where these rules apply. It's going to happen. And capital is like water. It will find a way through every crack. And so people who think those rules are going to stop external investment, I'm afraid they're not. But the problem is, because of those rules, we're now creating a set of artificial structures which are much more complex, they're more costly, and they're opaque, and they're arguably set outside of the regulatory framework. So you've actually created a bigger long-term problem, I think, for the regulator and for the profession. And I have other concerns about it as well. But those rules are long overdue for change. I don't think they will change anytime soon because I think people somehow think that they protect the profession in ways that can't be done any other way, and it's just not true.
Okay, and just going back to what you said earlier about there's a huge sort of appetite or interest in the law firm from private capital. Is there a particular kind of sweet spot? I know that the firms that have gone down this route so far have either been in a more volume business, in PI or in matrimonial. Are there particular sort of targets, whether it's in terms of firms' turnover or size or practice areas that's of interest?
It depends on the investor, so investors are not all the same. They're not all created equal. They come in many shapes and sizes. They have many strategies. There are good, bad and ugly ones. And I think what they primarily focus on, what is most important to them is there an ambitious, energetic, focused leadership team that has a vision that they can get on board with and help develop and grow and improve. And if they have that, then they will look at all kinds of strategies because, like I say, the legal market is a big, diverse global market. There's many different law firms pursuing many different strategies. So there's probably an investor for almost anyone who has those kinds of criteria: a good, energetic leadership team with a well thought out strategic plan, a good market position that can be made better. You'll find an investor.
Okay, so what's your vision for the next, or thoughts for the next 5 to 10 years in the legal profession?
What, for private capital
or just generally? How do you? I mean, we've seen over the last couple of years of profits sort of really growing and to numbers of even a few years ago you'd never imagined that firms would get to this level of profitability. We've seen a huge growth and appetite from US firms in London, more consolidation, takeovers, mergers, however you want to phrase it. How do you see the next 5 to 10 years panning out from your experience?
I think we're going through a period where it's not just, there's a lot of forces bearing on the profession, which has always been true, but what's different now is they're all converging and they're all accelerating in terms of their impact. So there's a trend towards consolidation, scaling up for some of the reasons that I talked about. That is happening in every professional services sector, and the law is no exception. So it's just increasingly hard to run a successful business at a very small scale in the law. In the old days, it didn't matter because you could just get a couple of people in a room, and you could run a small law firm like that, no problem. That's so much harder now because of the cost, the compliance, the getting the right talent, the technology, all those things, so much harder. And so scaling up makes a lot of sense. That's a big force, and I don't think that's going to go away. I mean, we've seen $3 billion plus transatlantic law firm mergers in the last 4 months. That won't be the last of them because there's inexorable forces driving that. Of course, there's technology and AI. There's many different things that you can talk about as forces. But at the end of the day, I'm an optimist, and I've always been bullish about the future for good lawyers, not for bad lawyers, but for good lawyers. I think there's always going to be a market. I think the world is becoming more complex at a much faster rate, that it's becoming commoditized by automation, by technology, and even by AI, although I think that is a transformational force on the industry. And those lawyers, I think, who are smart, adaptable, willing to change to the environment as the environment changes around them, and those firms that do that, they will continue to do very, very well.
Okay. And just, I think a lot of people listening will be interested in your background, David. Obviously, you've been a well-known figure in the legal industry. Did you ever have a mentor?
I did, yeah, I did. It wasn't a formal mentor, but an informal mentor. Yeah, it was the partner I first started working for when I qualified with the firm, Philip Wood, who many of your listeners will know, since he wrote some of the foundational books on finance law. His seminal work was The Law and Practice of International Finance, but he's gone on to write many books. And Philip was a great influence because even when I started as a young lawyer back in the 1980s, he had a global view of how the practice of law would develop as a global profession. And he was absolutely right about that. And I think, there were many times, I think, in those days when people thought he was up in the clouds somewhere, but he had a vision, and he was right. And he always encouraged me, and he has a very big heart, and I sort of tried to learn from that.
And what would be the best advice you could give to someone who's a managing partner now, facing all the challenges we've discussed? Is there any words of wisdom through your career that you could want to impart on somebody? Sorry, that was a big question. Or a different way of looking at it. Is there the best advice you've ever had?
I think I like to answer that, I think, by saying, I loved my role running. I do come across managing partners who appear to hate their role, and who really don't enjoy the when they're getting grief from partners and so on. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I think the reason for that is because fundamentally I'm fascinated by people, what motivates them and what drives them, and so on. And if you're leading a people business, I think it's difficult to do that successfully if actually you're not that interested in people. And it's not just about the numbers. It's yes, the numbers are key. The business aspects are absolutely key. But at the root of every law firm is people. And how do you motivate those people? How do you get the best out of them? How do you inspire them? How do you, that to me that's the real job. If you're a managing partner. So
it's really helpful and good advice. And I think listening to you and sort of wrapping everything up you've said, it sounds that you and Wim together would be great sounding board and help for maybe law firms or management boards that are just not sure where the future's looking, all the pressures bearing from all different angles, and perhaps private capital investment would be a good option, or perhaps not for certain firms.
It might not be. It depends on, but I mean, fundamentally, I think that the private capital coming into the legal industry is something that as a managing partner, you've got to look at as an opportunity, not as a threat, not as, oh, I don't like this, or this won't work for us, or whatever. That may be true, but start by thinking, where's the opportunity in this for my firm? That seems to me to be really crucial. And in the long run, I think the advent of capital, bringing in new ideas, bringing in new people, bringing in new talent, because just one example of that, I think the law firm of the future is going to be a much better multidisciplinary business with technologies working alongside the lawyers. And the firms that can crack that and get that functioning effectively, they're going to be the winners. And that is one thing that private capital is typically very, very good at, bringing in those additional skills and talents to turbocharge the performance of the firm.
Brilliant. I think that's a great visionary message to end on, David. And thank you for your time and for talking to me. And your details and your contacts for you and Wim are online to share for people to get in touch with, or I can introduce them to you. And thank you for sharing your experience and your vision for the future.
It's a pleasure, Jonathan. It's a great privilege to work in this profession, and my entire life has been in it. So if I can help it through this time of change, then I'm happy.
Thank you very much, David.
Thanks, Jonathan.